Council President, Mayor, and Council members, thank you for this opportunity to provide this presentation in response to the Council's request to explain recent chloride issues. With the opportunity to be before the public, I would like to take the opportunity to also explain how our water system works in general, just for information for the public, in case there's people that may not know. And for the benefit of the public, my name is Dan Lee. I am the City Engineer and Director of Engineering and Land Use. I oversee the obligations of Veolia, who manages our water system, in its relationship with the City of Rahway from a budgetary perspective. So that's why I'm providing the presentation tonight. So this is just a brief look at the presentation agenda. I know it might look a little long, but I am going to move through the slides relatively quickly. There's a lot of technical information, but I'm going to try to make it a little more simple so it's easier to understand. The general format for the presentation, the first three items essentially review how the water system works and functions, where we get our water from essentially. The next three items we'll discuss, and I apologize, Councilman, if I'm facing my back towards you just for the presentation. Items 4 through 6 are essentially discussions on how salty taste gets into our water and really what happened this past February. And the last three are general discussions in terms of the city's response, and then where you can find some more information. So moving into the source of our drinking water. I know this is a little difficult to see here. I'll try to zoom in when necessary. Sorry, got a little ahead of myself. So what is the source of our drinking water? So what you see here, it's a little difficult to make out, but this darker green line delineates the limit of the watershed for the water source for the City of Rahway. This is about a 41 square mile area. Within that watershed are about 30 miles of waterways. So all of the water that falls within this 41 square mile area at some point either enters the ground or makes its way into the rivers, which ultimately makes its way down to the City of Rahway. Once it gets to the City of Rahway, the water treatment plant takes up water from the river where the water is treated. And again, this is going to get a little basic, but in case you didn't know, any of the primary source of water into the rivers is rain. However, some of the water does also come from groundwater sources. However, the primary source comes from rainwater. As the rain hits the ground, it collects through curb gutters, through overland flow, ultimately into pipes, which ultimately discharge into rivers, makes its way to our water treatment plant, and then ultimately to your home. So once the water gets to the water treatment plant, there's essentially, and I know this is actually a simplified version of a very complicated system at the water treatment plant. What this basically sums down to is actually a 5-step process or a 5 filtration process. Obviously starting with the Rahway River. From there, water is pumped into what's called the packed tower aeration facility. What we have across here, I apologize, across the top are the technical names for the actual treatments. Below is just a basic description of what happens at each stage. So the first stage is a packed tower aeration, which removes lighter compounds from the water. From there, the water moves on to sedimentation basins number 1 and number 2, where the heavier solids, dirt and sediment, are removed from the water. We do have 2 chambers to provide for extra clarification. Following that process, we come to the membrane filters, which is a newer part of the system that was installed 7 years ago. That filters out smaller contaminants from the water. And then moving from there, the water moves into what's known as the GAC treatment facility. GAC stands for granular activated carbon. You may be familiar with carbon filters. This is essentially an extremely large-scale version of the filter you might have if you have a Brita filter or if you have a filter on your refrigerator water. But what happens here, the most commonly known contaminant that's removed from the water at this stage is PFAS. That's been more prevalent in the news lately. However, what also happens with the GAC filtration, taste and odor are really treated, and elements of the water that contribute to that are typically removed at this phase. Also, additives are added into the water, including chlorine or fluoride or any beneficial minerals. After water is treated there, it moves on to our 3 million gallon storage tank, and then ultimately pumped out to the system. And in the next slides, I'll go over how the water gets out of the system and into your homes. So, how does the water get to your property from there? So we talked previously about how the water comes down in the watershed to the City of Rahway, to the water treatment plant situated at the northwest part of the town. we went through the filtration process in the prior slide. Once that water is treated, the water coming down the Rahway River, it's commonly known as raw water. After the filtration process happens, the water is known as finished water. Once the water is finished, it's pumped into our storage tank. It's a 3 million gallon ground storage tank. From there, the water is pumped up into elevated spheres. We have a 500,000 gallon water sphere at the water treatment plant. We also have a 1.5 million gallon elevated tank down by the public works yard. So now the water is poised to be distributed to the system, but before it's distributed out to the public, this is where our interconnects come into play. What's an interconnect? An interconnect is essentially just a connection or a pipe to connect two different sources of water. So we obviously have our treatment plant, which produces our own water. We have two major backups. The primary backup is the interconnect with Middlesex Water Company. And our emergency backup in the event that we have any kind of a failure at the treatment plant, and our primary backup at Middlesex Water is with New Jersey American Water. And that connection is over by Public Works. So what happens at this stage, the water from who we typically purchase from when we need to, Middlesex Water, that enters our system just outside of the water treatment plant. The water becomes blended with our finished water, and then is known as blended water at that point. And from there, the water is pushed out into the system. So why does the water taste salty in the winter? So we bring you back to this slide where we looked at the watershed and where the water is coming from. So what we have here in our 41 square mile area, there are 6 major roadways that cross through the watershed. What happens in the wintertime with all of our major roads and all of our local roads is salting. All the salting, there's brining, there's also salt runoff that comes from the storage sheds. All of these operations are necessary to keep our roads safe. However, it unfortunately has the impact of also adding salts to the water that ultimately run down our river and make its way into our water system. The one benefit, if you could say, is this problem really only impacts the city of Rahway. Typically, the peaks typically occur in January and February, although we do experience this condition in December and March. And I'll get into a little bit of the magnitude of the storms and the impact of that in a later slide. But really, we primarily see this issue about 2 months out of the year. For people that have lived in Rahway for a while, this is something that you've experienced for many, many years. Some years you don't taste anything. Some years you taste a lot. I'm going to get into what happened this past February in one of the next slides. So salts, so what are chlorides? I keep talking about chlorides in the water. It's come up a couple times. So chlorides, it's essentially salt. It's those road salts that I was just talking about in the other slide. So the salts that get into the water, into the drinking water, ultimately end up at our treatment plant. And it's very difficult to remove chlorides from the water. And I'll get into some of the options for that coming up in one of the other slides. So in terms of chlorides themselves, we did experience a high level of chlorides this past February, but according to the EPA and the DEP, they both consider chlorides a secondary drinking water standard. So what does that mean? Secondary drinking water standard are those types of elements or impacts to water that affect the aesthetics of the water. So it's really a taste, color, or odor issue. It's not a health-related concern. So chloride is not considered to present a risk to human health and is safe to drink, and this is according to both EPA and DEP regulations. So how are chlorides addressed then? Although we do have them in the waters, there's a few different options. So dilution is the first. So I talked about blending before. Blending is the method that Rahway uses to mitigate chlorides in the water. So that interconnect that we have with Middlesex Water Company, we have the ability to close it completely, but we also have the ability to completely open it up. The maximum waters we can draw from them is about 2.5 million gallons per day. Typically in Rahway, on an average day, the water demands can be anywhere from 3 million gallons during the winter up to 7 million gallons in the summer months when people are watering lawns and outside and using more water. So dilution is what we're currently using. There are, however, other options. Backing up to dilution, dilution is a common practice and commonly used throughout the industry when it comes to our type of an issue where we have periodic concerns with the water. Other options that exist are distillation and reverse osmosis. These types of technology, typically you're going to see these most often on islands or areas that don't have access to some kind of a pure or fresh water. So you're looking at like desalination plants, things of that nature, where you have salty water 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, where you are constantly removing salt from the water. And the reason for that is the expense. Both distillation and reverse osmosis cost multi-million dollars, distillation being extremely expensive, up to $50 million, and that's just for the installation cost. For a reverse osmosis system, which was recommended to us by Veolia, their estimates were actually at 15 million. Our experts said about 10 million, and that's just to install this system. And then that doesn't even include then the annual operating costs. So $2 million for a distillation system and $1 million for a reverse osmosis system. So ultimately, for the city of Rahway, this is really an impractical solution because of the size of our system and because of the expenses required for something that really only presents itself most typically 2 months out of the year, and sometimes not even. So why was the taste of salt so strong in February? So there were multiple factors that occurred this year that from my review haven't all happened at the same time in the past. So we definitely saw a lot of complaints. I could smell the salts in the water, in the water that we receive in City Hall as well. But there were 4 primary factors that led to this. So excess salt supply. In the last few winters, we've had extremely mild winters. So there's been very little salt application as well as very little plowing. This resulted in excess salt supplies. As the mayor referenced previously, this is a state, actually not even statewide, this is a regional issue. Because there wasn't a lot of salting done, the supplies were extremely high. This year in particular, we had multiple small snowstorms. So it's a little odd, but it's actually better for us from a water quality perspective when we have a large snowstorm. When we have a large snowstorm, the salting's not done as heavily initially, because to put down salt before a large snowstorm, or an excess amount of salt before a large snowstorm, you're just going to be plowing it up. So typically salt's applied with enough salt to keep the roads safe, but not to the extent of what you see when you have small snowstorms. When you have small snowstorms, 2 to 3 inches, typically, because plowing operations typically begin when you know that snow is going to exceed 2 to 3 inches. When you have a storm that you know is only going to be a couple inches, the salt and brining gets put down heavy and early. And that's so to be able to avoid the need to bring out plows to clear the snow. So we had that issue this year. We had 6 storms this year between late December and mid-February, so in a little less than a 2-month period. So we essentially had back-to-back-to-back storms. So the chlorides were building up, and what happens with small storms is we also don't get the benefit of a large melt-off. So when we have large snowstorms and a large melt-off, all of that water melts, runs into the river, and helps to wash away the chlorides quickly. When we have small storms, there's a lot of salt and a little bit of snow, so we really don't have that melt-off to help wash the salt out of the river and into the bay. The third issue is drought warning status. We are actually still technically in a drought warning status right now. Drought warning status is actually one step below a full-blown drought emergency for the state. Once we get to an emergency for the state, then conservation requirements are mandated. So the city's ordinance, we have water conservation requirements. If the state elevated the drought condition to that level, then we would be in the most severe level of conservation. So what happens during a drought? The river levels are lower than normal, which means that anything in the water is more concentrated. So we have less water, but the salts stay the same. That means it's even more concentrated. In addition to that, what made the situation also worse was that because groundwater levels were also extremely low, any water that was hitting the ground was getting absorbed very quickly. So the salt-laden water was getting into the ground. Our backup water provider is Middlesex Water Company. Their primary source of water is groundwater. So we were getting reports from them in terms of their chloride levels, and what we were seeing from them is even their levels were elevating as well. So not only, and actually our emergency backup water provider, New Jersey American, their primary source is also surface waters, like Rahway. So they were also experiencing high chlorides for their water levels as well. If you saw any news reports, there were statements issued by the DEP, a lot of news reports going out about the concerns about salt levels in the water throughout the state. So these three factors, and then the fourth factor, really are what contributed to the high salt taste in the water. So inadequate forecasting by Veolia. So Veolia, they did act to mitigate chlorides. However, it was more reactive than proactive. And I'll get into that a little bit more in just a second. So ultimately what we have increased salt supply, we have increased salt application, we have increased concentrations of chlorides, we have increased or delayed response time from our water purveyor, and that led to the extremely high chlorides that we had in the water this year. So again, as discussed before, the inadequate forecasting by Veolia is really a result of failing to look at the issues that were before us, which were all known. This is not, none of this, the drought warning has been around since November. The small snowstorms were starting in December. The excess salt supply, that's just been known throughout the industry in terms of having large amounts of salt. So what's the city doing in response to what happened? As licensed operators and experts in drinking water production, Veolia is contractually responsible for providing quality water that's in conformance with the DEP and EPA regulations. But as a system owner, the city is the owner of the system. We are responsible to our citizens, and we're also responsible for holding Veolia to task. So the city's been in communication with the DEP. We continue to be in conversation with the DEP in terms of the impacts of chlorides in the water and other water quality standards that we want to make sure we're staying on top of. So February 13th, around February 13th was the peak of the issue. We had contacted DEP. They got back to us. I referenced some of the standards before in terms of the water quality and chlorides in the water not being a health factor. So that issue was addressed specifically in our communications with the DEP. So high chlorides do not pose a direct health risk, but are aesthetic in nature. However, having concern for people that may have concerns about the water, anyone that has a sodium restricted diet, anyone that has issues or concerns about high sodiums, those are the only people that really should be consulting their physicians about concerns because you have a sodium or chloride specific concern. But we contacted the DEP because the regulations are one thing, but we wanted to make sure that our current condition really was still in compliance with what the DEP and EPA are looking at. So in terms of specifically chlorides, we're working with Veolia to develop an early warning action plan. That'll include early trigger points, not reactive trigger points, in terms of when to begin blending the water or increase the blending of the water, as well as notifying stakeholders. So one of the concerns and complaints that we got from the public was lack of early notice. Our notice did go out, I think, a day or two before. Obviously, a little bit more notice would have been great, would have been better. So these types of things, we're holding Veolia responsible to take a look at and analyze to make sure they're looking at indicators for what might lead to high chlorides in the water so that we can get information out to the public earlier. As part of the process, we'll also require them to review optimal blending schedule. So there is a bit of a nuance to when to start blending and how much to blend. There obviously is an extra cost that comes with buying additional water from Middlesex Water Company. But really, the ultimate goal for us and for the water system is to provide the best quality water we can. If we have backup sources to provide water to avoid the chlorides issues, we want to take that action. That really didn't happen quick enough this time around, and we do not want that to happen again. And finally, referring back to the slide where you saw the 6 highways that cross through our watershed, we're going to coordinate with the DOT for early notification of salting activities so we know ahead of time when they're going to be putting salt down so that we can also plan accordingly from that perspective. From an overall water quality perspective, we are holding quarterly meetings with Veolia. But what we'll be adding to this is a specific review of the chloride issues. So with the quarterly meetings happening the quarter before we expect the winter events, we'll be reviewing with them, what they're looking at, what the forecast looks like now, should the city be preparing for notices, and any other advanced information that can help us reduce the issue in the water and get as much information out to the public as quickly as possible. So in those quarterly meetings, typically we're doing a review of potential water quality threats, including those that are known and those that are also coming down the pike. And you'll see some of the outcomes of these quarterly meetings for prior improvements that the city's made on my next slide. We'll also talk about operational concerns that may be associated with the potential water threats, as well as capital improvement requirements that may be necessary to assist or to avoid the operational concerns and to mitigate any potential water quality issues. So what investments has the city already made? As alluded to in the previous slide, so actually before I move on to this, so the Rahway Water Company has actually been in existence since 1859, believe it or not. The water treatment plant itself was constructed in 1872. So the water treatment plant has been around for an extremely long time. City of Rahway has been making improvements and investments into the water treatment facility since then. Obviously, as the population of Rahway has grown and technology has changed, there's been improvements and expansions year after year after year. So some of the more recent improvements starting from 2016, I mentioned before the interconnect with Middlesex Water Company. That interconnect was a cost of about $2 million. It was expanded to provide, so I discussed what the interconnect is before. That basically connects our water system with Middlesex water system. This is primarily used for high chlorides and drought conditions or other emergencies. So we've been hit with both of those, the drought conditions as well as the chloride issues. So we've increased our purchase of water from Middlesex Water to help offset the chlorides in the water. We're back down to a normal level right now, so we are not buying any extra water from Middlesex Water. But that interconnect was installed exactly for this purpose. That interconnect was about 1.2 miles. It was a 16-inch water main that runs mostly down Madison Avenue and terminates just outside of the water treatment plant. In 2017, we installed a new membrane filtration system at the cost of $10 million. That system significantly improved the filtration capability of the plant. We used to have an old gravity-fed system that really limited how quickly water could be processed through the plant. So not only, and the technology with this new membrane allows for better quality of water. So in addition to the better quality, it also allowed for higher capacity of production. So we were approximately at about 4.4 million gallons per day was our maximum capability. Once this system was installed, that was increased to about 7.7 million gallons per day. So again, future-proofing the system, that level of need is not required right now, but in the event of future development, more demands on water systems. We do have Merck that came back into town, so the water demands has increased significantly. This improvement at the time really was future thinking to make sure that we were able to provide the amount of water that we really need for the city. In 2019, there was a PFAS treatment testing and implementation at the cost of $400,000, and that was actually just for the testing costs. And for the initial implementation, we do have annual costs that are attributed to this as well. So the city directed Veolia. So in 2019, the DEP indicated that they were going to be releasing new regulations in 2020 that would have a 1-year time frame for compliance. So by 2021, if you exceeded certain levels of PFAS, you had to have improvements or a plan in place for how you were going to address it. The city didn't wait for that. So in 2019, the city directed Veolia to test options for addressing pending PFAS legislation. They didn't want to sit around and wait. That wasn't something, and that wasn't an option that the administration really wanted to even consider. So by 2020, ultimately, out of a few options that were looked at, the granular activated carbon system that I referenced before, that was a system that was landed on. It's one of the most common PFAS removal methods in the water industry. That system came online a full year ahead of the actual deadline for compliance with the DEP requirements. And our most recent project in terms of water quality is our Water Quality Assurance Initiative. That's the lead service line replacement project. So if you live in Rahway, you probably got a letter from my office. I've spent many hours over the last couple years putting together many letters trying to inform the public about this project. So this project, it's estimated to be a total cost of $8 million. So this is the city's lead service. This is the city's lead service line replacement project. We actually completed phases 1 and 2 in 2024. Phases 1 and 2 were really the investigation phase to figure out the status of everyone's service line in the city of Rahway. So if you have a lead or galvanized service line, either on the customer side, which is the portion that leads into your house, or on the utility side, which is the portion that is between the main and essentially the curb line, there's a spreadsheet you can go onto, and I'm going to give you links at the end. You can go and check the status of your service line. If you have a lead or galvanized service line, the mayor and council have secured significant funding, grant funding for this project, where we can replace every service line that has lead or galvanized in it at no cost to the homeowners. The only thing we need from the homeowners is for you to come in, for you to go online, get the right of entry form, and just sign that, and then that'll give us the right to come into your house if you have a house side lead or galvanized service line, and we'll replace that for you. So that's actually phase 3, and that's currently underway right now. As of the completion of our inventory in November, we have about 500 to 600 confirmed lead or galvanized service lines. Not all of them require entry to the homes, because if it's the utility side, we can do the replacement in the street. But phase 3 is doing about half of those replacements. We will have a phase 4. Phase 3 is on target to be completed by the end of this year. Phase 4 we're looking to complete by the end of next year. The DEP and EPA mandated deadline to replace all lead service lines is 2031. So we're targeting to be complete next year, 5 years ahead of the required deadline. Looking a little further back, the city of Rahway has not had any water quality related violations in the last 25 years. And a lot of the funding that you see for these projects here, essentially over $13 million, has been received in grant funds or forgivable loans or low interest loans. So it's not just taxpayers and rate money that's coming to pay for this. The mayor and administration and council have worked very hard to obtain grant and other funding sources to pay for this. So here are a few sources for information. As I mentioned before, the lead service line project. If you have any questions about that, you can go on this link. I can pull this back up later on. If you have any questions, the right of entry form is here. You can go on and check the inventory. You can see if your property has a lead service line or not. The next QR code and link is for the New Jersey Drinking Water Watch. This information is the same information that's reported to the DEP by Veolia for the drinking water that comes into your home. You can go in here and take a look and see any of the information that you'd like to as far as testing and other state requirements for reporting. And then the Consumer Confidence Report gives you specific information that's issued by Veolia. This is also state mandated to be provided. You typically receive a copy of this report or a link to it in your water bill. The one that you go on to see, if you go on to this link, you'll see that it's actually for 2024, for 2023, because the prior years doesn't come out until June, so we still have a few months before that issue comes out. So that, and again, Council, I apologize for having my back to you the whole time. That concludes my presentation, but I wanted to provide an opportunity for the Council to ask any questions. And if, Council President, if it would be okay if I could open the floor for comments from the public. I'd prefer to gather all comments and questions from the public and then answer all of them together, but obviously any questions from the mayor and council I'll answer immediately.
Okay, we're going to start the questioning here. My question was, what specific caused the sodium level to raise in the first place?
So as I mentioned, there was a combination of those the 3 factors really was the increase in supply, increase of application, and then the reduced water supply. The drought conditions. So it really was, I mean, there really truly was more salt being put down on the roads, and then less water. So the concentration of the salt in the water made it even worse.
Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, I'll ask.
You want to start?
Yeah, thank you, Council President, and thank you, Mr. Lee. Very informative presentation.
Thank you.
I think the question I want to ask is, outside of the safety, I think the number one priority with our residents and with the city is the cost. Will any of these costs that the city spent to address this be passed on to the city or to the residents and taxpayers?
That's all included in. Okay, no. No, it'll have no immediate effect on the rate that water users are paying.
Question, by any chance, when this issue arose, did we notify Veolia or did they let us know about the issue?
So we have been in communication with Veolia about the issues throughout. However, the extent of the issue really wasn't brought to our attention at the time, and that's hence the reaction and our proposed changes with our communications with Veolia moving forward. We really want that advance notice. We want to know when there's a major issue coming down the pike.
Well, my question would follow his then. What policies or procedures are Veolia going to put into place in regards to preventing this from happening again?
Thank you. So that goes back to, that actually goes back to the early warning action plan. So that will become a part of, or we're requiring that become a part of their standard operating procedure. So in that, again, we talk about looking at future issues, how early to notify various triggers that we see coming down the water system that will then trigger and require Veolia, hey, give us notice so we can react appropriately to get information out to the public.
Council President, I have a question.
I can just go first really quick. Thank you again for that presentation. Very, very informative. Just a quick question. Do we, as in the city administration, do we have a plan in place as to how future water quality updates will be communicated to our residents?
So that also that comes in. That is in alignment with the early warning action plan as well. In terms of, I guess that's really more geared towards emergencies. You're asking more from the perspective of large term changes? I mean, you've seen in some of what I presented today, the actions that the city of Rahway's taken. We don't wait. We didn't wait for PFAS. We're not waiting for lead. Any information that we receive from the DEP in terms of policy changes that are coming down the pike or legislation, we're looking to react as soon as possible, not by the deadline. We're looking to respond ahead of the deadline, so we can address and provide the best water quality we can as soon as possible.
And providing that information to the residents as soon as it becomes available. Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. Okay.
Ms. Newberry?
Thank you very much. On slide 4, you were saying how there should have been earlier action taken to reduce chloride levels in the water by Veolia. How is the city holding Veolia accountable for this incident?
So the actions that we've taken with them, really in looking at and requiring the look at the chlorides issues in terms of the quarterly meetings that we're having with them. So they'll be meeting and reporting directly to administration in terms of being prepared. So really with holding them to task from that perspective is primary. The early warning action plan and the creation of that, the publication of it, and our use of it is really what we're holding them to, because that really is what should have been done in the first place.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the presentation.
You're welcome.
So that actually leads right into my question, and that is, were there steps that Veolia could have taken to prevent this from happening to begin with?
So absolutely. In terms of, I touched on it briefly, and I didn't want to get too technical on it, but there's a lot that Veolia can do from the perspective of blending, and in terms of forecasting and looking up the stream, they can be testing for chlorides further up the stream. They could have the communications with the DOT to know when the salting's happening, so then they can predict when it's going to hit. Really, what happened in February is essentially what would have happened had they been tracking and monitoring that. It just happened late. So what happens is the chlorides already get into the treatment plant. Once the chlorides are in the water in the treatment plant and it fills up that 3 million gallon storage tank, at that point, we really have no options. We have to pump that water out to the system. The DEP actually technically, they don't even allow you to dump. You cannot release treated water back into the river. Might sound a little crazy. So water that we took from the river we took the water from the river, we treated it, cleaned it, and we're storing it, even if it has high chloride levels, the DEP says you can't release that back into the river. So it has to be sent out into the system. What really could have happened is before those chlorides get into our system, it's, hey, we have high chloride levels coming down the river. We need to slow our treatment plant down and increase our purchased water through our interconnect so that the water that we have in the tank is still clean water, not chloride-laden water. And that water can stay there and can be pumped into the system and provide the pressure. And we also supplement it with then the Middlesex water, and we increase that water. So it all happens earlier, and that could have happened now. That's why the levels did drop off relatively quickly, because the reaction happened and it was, okay, let's do this. It really should have happened a week earlier.
Mr. Lee, thank you for the presentation. It was good. I'm glad that you were able to inform the citizens here in the city of Rahway. But my question is, how credible are the at-home tests that people are posting online?
So the straight answer, I mean, they're credible, but it depends on what you're trying to read. So those at-home tests, the meters that you can find either at like a supply store or on Amazon, they are typically used to read total dissolved solids. Total dissolved solids, though, doesn't tell you how many of those solids are desired solids and how many of those are contaminant or undesired solids. So although it might give you a good reading, it actually, you don't know what you're reading. So it might be reading your fluorides, it might be reading chlorides, it might be reading something else, but you don't know that. Really, the true, if you want a true test of the water, you need to take a sample and you need to send that to a lab to have it tested. So there is a place for the use of those TDS meters. I think people that have saltwater fish tanks, things like that, like there is a place for it, but in terms of actual overall water quality, that's not the device to use.
I have one question through you, Council President. Mr. Lee, thank you for coming out today and giving your presentation. I thought it was extremely intuitive, and I hope that the residents can see it for what it is, which is very straightforward. I just want to know, in reference of timing, because everything's timing these days, right? How long after Veolia became aware of the problem did it take for them to contact the city and take actual action?
Well, we were in contact on almost a daily basis, but really the city had to, what was really the issue was the city had to react to really escalate. That was really the bigger concern, was we were at certain levels of chlorides and just unacceptable. We were receiving many complaints from the public. That notification really should have come from Veolia.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll open this to the public now for the, now anybody in the public, only on the issue, on the water issue. If you'd like to come up and speak, you do so. Just say your name, address, please.
And Council President, I'll take notes on the comments and questions, so if there's any that need answering, if you'd like, I can answer them after the fact.
Ready? Yes. Hi, Jeff Robinson. Yeah, Jeff Robinson, 244 Stanton Street in Rahway. I'm also, as you know, the chair of the city's Environmental Commission. Excellent presentation by our city engineer, Dan Lee. Just a couple of quick comments and maybe a question regarding whether the high salt level is bad for your health. Despite what the DEP and the EPA says, if you're one of the thousands of people in Rahway of high blood pressure, you really shouldn't be drinking the water on a regular basis. So that's my first comment. Also, many people don't know that Rahway is the only municipality in the state that gets its drinking water from the Rahway River. And the high salt levels, first of all, is nothing new. We've had this problem for years. Of course, it was really quite bad this past winter. And as Dan Lee pointed out, a lot of the problem is because of road salting. And I would say that, and I've noticed it in my travels all around the county, especially within the watershed north of here, towns just go all out dumping salt. They just, and maybe they would say an abundance of caution to protect the roads, but I've seen just salt just dumped really indiscriminately, just too much. And almost all of that is not in Rahway. It's the towns, the municipalities north of Rahway. Cranford, Clark, the Oranges, New Providence, all those towns north of us. Also the DOT, who maintains the state highways. So I don't know if there's a way that the city of Rahway can reach out to some of these towns and discuss this issue. I know it's probably easier to talk to the DOT, but it really is the all of the towns north of us in the northern part of the watershed that are the cause of this, and we get all of this because we're downriver. So if there's some way that we can reach out to other municipalities about this, that might help. So, okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, Ron McCray, 840 East Hazelwood Avenue. I had 3 questions based on the presentation. First, I'd like to say it was a good presentation and it's very informative. My 3 questions here. One, last week I was in the park, Rahway Park, and there was over a dozen fish that was unfortunately dead. I'd like to know, to your knowledge, has this any relationship or connection based on that water that caused these fish to be dead? Based on the presentation. 2, you indicated in reference to the service line and the possibility of what the type of pipes you may have and if it has to be replaced. And as you indicated, there will not be any cost. So with that, and I'm just going to put this out here now and then come back later, then my question to tag onto that, then why is the water bill for the service line constantly going up? I had another question, but I just forgot it just that quick. So at this time, those are the 2 at this moment.
Hi there, Pranita Bijlani, 103 Princeton Avenue. And I just wanted to add on to what Jeff Robinson said, as well as this last gentleman. I know that there is, concern among environmentalists about salt pollution in general, and that it can cause contamination to ecosystems and harm, animals that rely on those systems, and vernal pools and things like that. So, I just wanted to echo and kind of add and agree with what Jeff Robinson said about concern about perhaps we can reach out to other municipalities that maybe, whether salt levels can be reduced in terms of application to avoid these kinds of problems and, avoid harm to ecosystems as well.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Hi, Andrew Garcia Phillips. I appreciate the presentation too. It was excellent information. I just wanted to offer one suggestion or idea. The gentleman explained that doing a reverse osmosis filter would be expensive, $10 to $15 million, and would cost $1 million a year to operate. I wonder if there's a third option that you could consider, and this might be completely ridiculous, I don't know. But what I do in my own home is that I store water in the summertime when the water tastes good. I fill a bunch of jugs with water, and then when the water gets really bad a couple weeks during the winter, I use those jugs. And I wonder if we could store more water during the good summer months when the water is plentiful and tastes better. I don't know how much that is, 3 million gallons a day. I don't know what that looks like. But we could save 30 days worth of water. Is 90 million gallons of water as big as a football stadium, or small enough that we could do that and save some water when the water is plentiful and then use it when it tastes bad? Just an idea. Thank you.
Thank you. Good point.
Yes, Ron McCray, 840 East Hazelwood Avenue. My other question in reference to the PFAS. Now, this is a question, but I also want to also let you know that 6 years ago, I found out and I done my studies in reference to PFAS. Can you give a little more, if not now, the history of the PFAS? What is it? How to get where, the process, et cetera, more details, because I think a lot of the public have no clue about what PFAS is.
Okay. Anyone else? All right, we're going to close this part of the meeting, and Mr. Barham, you'll Mr. Lee, you're going to answer the questions now?
Yes, sir. Okay. Some very good questions from the public. I'll start with Mr. Robinson in terms of whether the chlorides are bad for health and for people with high blood pressure. Certainly any additional sodium or chloride could pose health issues. And I'm not a health expert, but I'm just going to provide some information that I've come across in my research. The average chloride level in the water during the peak issue that we had in February was about 400 milligrams per liter. Your typical single McDonald's meal is in the range of 1,400 to 1,500 milligrams of sodium or chloride. So just to put things in perspective, and the DEP even uses the reference to the amount of sodium that you intake in your food just throughout the day, even in high chloride conditions, it far exceeds, just from your food, the amount of salt you intake far exceeds what you could intake during a high chloride situation with water. So that's just to put that into perspective. But it's not to say that, as a reference in my slides, if you have a high sodium issue or high chloride issue, you really should talk to your doctor to see if there's concerns with the water that's being distributed to your home when we have chloride issues. One of the other comments, Rahway is the only municipality in the state that's drawing water from the Rahway River. That is mostly true, and appreciate the acknowledgement of that, as Rahway is one of the communities that has to struggle through this issue. But there are apparently other water sources that actually end up getting groundwater. So the water from the Rahway River, some of it does make its way into the ground. So the state does consider that there are other potential water providers that do receive some of the water from the river. And then in terms of the third comment, it was regarding too much salt, essentially from neighboring communities, and to potentially reach out to towns. I would actually call on the public to assist with this a bit. So one of the requirements from the DEP that the city of Rahway is beholden to, as is every municipality in the state, it's through what's called an Egyptes permit. This is the permit that essentially allows us to discharge water into the river that ultimately flows to the oceans. As part of that permit, municipalities that put salt down on the road, and this includes the states and the DOT's agencies as well, you are obligated to actually go back after a storm. And if there are piles of salt on the road, you're obligated to clean that up. The DEP is now enforcing that. It's more of a recent issue, but because of issues like this, the DEP is mandating that type of a follow-up. The recent February issue was brought to light, and it got to the DEP's level also from public complaints as well. And that's how we got in touch with the DEP and got some information from them. I'd love to see some help from the public, also calling out other communities that are doing the same thing, that maybe have lots of salt down on the road. Mr. McCray had asked about noticing dead fish in the river. I apologize, but I actually don't know if that's directly related to this. And I'm not sure if that would be reported to the county, I believe. So if you have any other information, maybe I can take that and report that on your behalf. In terms of the service line and why the bill is going up, yeah. So the service line replacement project is actually fully funded by grants, completely funded. So we have I said $8 million on the slide, but it's actually $8.125 million in grants that we've received from county, state, and federal level funding sources. So yeah, that's at no cost to the homeowner. That has no impact on the water bill whatsoever. And then in terms of PFAS, what is it? I could spend quite a while speaking, but I think I've already taken up a lot of the council members' time tonight. In general, I'll just say PFAS is essentially in everything. PFAS is a family of chemicals that's essentially used in anything that's used for waterproofing, anything that makes things non-stick. Most commonly, it's known for being in firefighting chemicals that are used at airports. But what's been found through studies is that essentially it has an extremely long half-life, if you'll say, where it takes a long time for it to go away. It is known to be harmful to humans, and that's why the city of Rahway was so proactive with implementing the granular activated carbon. Most testing periods, we're seeing levels that are in the non-detect range. So that's less typically, actually in 2021, the regulation was 14 parts per trillion. Last year, the DEP actually reduced that to 4 parts per trillion. It's not in enforcement yet. They passed the legislation, but it's not being enforced just yet, but it will be imposed soon. Our levels are already below that because of the changes that were made in 2019. So if anyone has any other questions, I can go into a lot more detail, but after the meeting. Then, let me see, I think Miss Vigilani, yes, okay, had a similar comment about contacting other municipalities. The same comment applies there in terms of the NGIPT's requirement. These communities really should be doing their own cleanup as it is, but I think additional outreach to ask for assistance with reducing salting would help. And then finally, Mr. Garcia Phillips had asked, in terms of a third option, I'd love to do it. I would love to be able to store clean water, but the city of Rahway is consuming on average about 5 million gallons a day. So if you've ever been to the park and you've seen that massive water tank, that's 3 million gallons. So if you imagine we wanted to store 1 month's worth, so 150 million gallons, yeah, we'd probably cover most of Rahway with it. So it's unfortunately unfeasible. I think that's all the questions.
Very good report, and thank you very much.